Reading American Zion, the Old Testament as a political text from the Revolution to the Civil War. Evan Shalev. Introduction. Our American Israel is a term frequently used. Bill Abbott, 1798. The whole of America is Zion itself from north to south. Joseph Smith, 1844. Between two American wars, one to replace the British imperial rule and found a republic, the other fourscore years later to secure the Union, created by the first, a biblical word of Hebraic political imagination, burgeoned and then withered. The idea of America as a new Israel, founded on a Calvinist ethos that was not narrowly denominational but inclined towards the Old Testament, originated in an insular 17th century outlook that singled out the New England as a, quote, chosen nation, end quote. It reverberated and expanded with the onset of the revolution throughout the colonies. Colonies turned states as Americans repeatedly heard that they were, quote, at present the people of Israel, end quote, or were establishing, quote, our Israel, end quote. This image of an American people chosen for a special destiny was to remain a mainstay of American self-fashioning and the negotiation of nationhood for years. We still live with the legacy of that centuries-old identification. So prevalent was the Old Testament in the early culture of the United States that for decades after the start of the 19th century, it was, in the words of Perry Miller, as, quote, omnipresent as the air that people breathe, end quote. But despite a rich historiography of the religious quality of politics in the early United States, we have still to recognize some of the central components and characteristics of the identification of the United States as Israel, hence to come to terms with its meaning and significance. In American Zion, I explore the role that the Old Testament played in the politics of the early republic and in Americans' negotiation of nationhood, analyzing for the first time some of the most widespread interpretations of the Hebrew Bible as a political text or a text about national politics. I intend to reveal the extent of that biblicism in American culture and uncover its distinct character. One of my central aims is, in short, to expand vastly our sense of the role of the Hebrew Bible, and particularly the role of the biblical Israel, in the formation of an American national and political culture from the Revolution to the Civil War. In American Zion, I explore a robust discourse which mobilized the Old Testament or specific sections of the Hebrew Bible that recounted the political history of the Israelites. In so doing, I seek to bring about a better understanding of the debate about the early national life of the United States. Taking these political readings of the Bible as a springboard, I describe key tropes and images throughout which contemporaries identified with and as the Israelite political community. This identification provided politically conscious Americans with a powerful rhetorical mode, this is, quote, the American Israel, end quote, for expressing a boastful patriotism and a budding national sentiment. Yet, that biblicism also reveals a political cosmology ridden with terrific anxieties relating to the sustainability of the Union and its future. The idea of American chosenness and its corollary that the United States was a new Israel manifests a deep ambivalence towards a secular vision of modernity and enlightened politics based solely on human reason and will. Politically conscious Americans, who in many ways broke with Orthodox Christianity, operated for years after the creation of the Republic in a civic universe impregnated with a Calvinist tainted biblicism, while Americans, in Thomas Paine's words, might have had it in their power to start the world over again. They chose to create it in the shadow of ancient worlds long departed. Such impulses reveal a persistent American national need to dress up the new in the old and familiar, and a deep ambivalence towards modernity and the complicates straightforward understandings of a quote, nation-born modern, end quote. This Old Testament biblicism The identification of the United States as a God-chosen Israel provided a language to conciliate a modern Republican experiment with the desire for biblical sanction. It could thus help alleviate anxieties related to the limits of human authority and legitimize the unprecedented American federal and Republican endeavor. Tense and contradictory, Republican and biblical, the early United States was forward-looking, and as Theodore Bozeman would have put it, quote, primitivist, end quote, or deeply attracted to the narratives, language, and ordinances of biblical times. From its earliest days, Christianity has had a complex relationship with the Hebrew Bible, starting with the conflict between Peter and Matthew on the one hand, and Paul on the other, regarding the place of Hebrew law in the Christian order. As a political text, the importance of the Hebrew Bible has had its great explorers for millennia, beginning perhaps in the Christian world and Eusebius Constantine's ecclesiastical counselor. Although that history cannot be retold here, it is worth noting that early modern thinkers frequently dwelt on the political aspect of the Hebrew Bible, although many of them rejected an ecclesiastical framework for political life. Spinoza, Hobbes, Bale, Voltaire, and Rousseau all recognized and grappled with the meaning of such biblical Hebraic themes as a Mosaic constitution as crucial to the history of political thought, even as they differed sharply on the meaning and desirability of the biblical example. Once formed Christianity, particularly its Calvinistic form, reinstated the Old Testament to a central place within Christianity. It reopened the issues of national chosenness and election. The revolutionary stakes in this clash are most dramatically evident in the case of 17th century England, which had the most developed historiography in this area, but the United States is where the political legacy of the Old Testament blossomed latest and has endured most strongly. Calvinism, whose Reformed Protestantism was particularly attuned to the Old Testament, outnumbered other denominations from early in the history of the North American British settlements. With their distinct modes of public rhetoric and action, Calvinist columnists frequently characterized themselves as the modern equivalent of the chosen people, a new Israel. The Puritans, the first and dominant group of British North American Reformed Protestants, saw themselves as Israelites fleeing a new Egyptian captivity, crossing to a sea to reach freedom and taking possession of a promised land. It was they who introduced the, quote, chosen people, end quote, doctrine into the New World and viewed themselves as the successors of the children of Israel and the bearers of a renewed covenant with God. We have recently learned about the wider context of 17th century European Christian Hebraism through Hebraic political studies as a discipline whose interest in the Hebraic tradition and political thought. We can now better appreciate that many European and Atlantic communities similarly felt themselves to be new Israels in the 17th century. By the late 18th century, the moment of Hebraic introspection was long over in Europe. Yet, as historians have recognized, quote, although Puritanism had collapsed as a total way of life by the 18th century, it continued to exert a powerful influence on the public life of the new United States, end quote. One of its lasting intellectual legacies was the central role that the Old Testament played in American public life. An obsession with these scriptures permeated, quote, the writing of the elite and the speech of the humble, end quote, in the early United States, to the extent that it became, quote, the common coinage of the realm, end quote, and it was after the Bible's primacy began to corrode in Europe, and Americans performed a last great act of political Hebraism, as the citizens of the young American Republic witnessed a remarkable effort to construct their newly established polity as an Old Testament nation, an American Zion. Americans of the early United States may have already been far removed from Calvinism, strictly understood, yet they elaborated a discourse whose origins can be traced to Calvin's Geneva, and which prospered, thrived, and gained a life of its own in the early Republic. We now know much about the Anglo-American millenarianism engendered in the wake of the 18th century imperial military conflicts in the New World, especially the French and Indian War, 1754-1763, which ended in a sweeping British victory in North America. That Chiliasm, which fed into the old notion that America was favored by God, flourished in the ensuing revolution and became adapted to the needs of the new nation. Public speakers subsequently intensified the rhetoric of the young republic's millenarian role as the quote redeemer nation end quote. The American political theology that stands at the center of this book coexisted with the national or civic millenarianism and occasionally intertwined with it, but was more concerned with worldly affairs. Its adherents were less troubled with, although often aware of, America's role as the end of days and more attuned to the history of the Israelites and its bearing on the United States, national politics, and the politics of the nation. In the most basic sense, this stance reflects Americans' quarrel with the meaning of becoming and being a nation by providing a historical example of the God-favored Israelites against which to measure and construct their own American nation. The Bible in the early United States was, in the words of a cogent historian, quote, the most important, most printed, most distributed, and most read written text in North America up through the 19th century, end quote. Its narratives and language dominated the intellectual and spiritual lives of untold millions of Americans, a preeminence that may have coincided with the American Bible Society's great drive of 1829 to 1831 to distribute a Bible to every household in the nation. But as universal and critical as the Bible was as a whole, it was its opening Hebrew Testament that was, for decades after the creation of the United States, the source for a massive outpouring of speeches, polemical newspaper articles, and sermons on issues from independence to war, constitutionalism to federations. The Old Testament's themes may indeed have, quote, suffused the minds, end quote, of the citizens of the young United States, if, as Sackman Berkowitz has demonstrated, New England clergy extended the promise of a covenant from New England to cover, quote, America, end quote. Americans from other regions and denominations embraced such notions as well. For example, Thomas Jefferson, who is not suspect as either a Calvinist or a New Englander, envisioned as early as 1776 a great seal for the young United States that represented on one of its sides the people of Israel, led by the pillar of fire in the desert. Decades later, as the President of the United States, Jefferson still harbored such sensibilities, referring in his first inaugural address to the United States as a, quote, chosen country, end quote, and appealing 4 years later in a second to, quote, the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our fathers as Israel of old from their native land and planted them in a country flowing with all the necessaries and comforts of life, end quote. That such language was so powerfully entrenched in the root and the most theist of minds demonstrates how common understandings of America as a second Israel became in public discourse of the early United States, and how a language permeated with Calvinism provided a constructive mode of political expression for an emerging American national culture long after rigid Orthodox Calvinism itself had begun to fade. That Old Testamentism would further expand in the age of the Second Great Awakening to the powerful, quote, Christian Republican synthesis, end quote, the unique and characteristic American amalgamation of evangelical Protestantism, Republican ideology, and common sense moral reasoning. As I demonstrate in this book's final chapter, the unprecedented religious expansion and intensification of the Great Awakening was to become, however, a two-edged sword that eventually did more to diminish and to increase the role of the Old Testament in public politics. The participants in the discourse of this Old Testament biblicism were almost exclusively Christians and were likely to be educated and politically conscious. They often treated, quote, the American Israel, quote, in terms that were not metaphorical but rather demonstrative of their conviction of a God still operative in history. Nevertheless, the political discussions was commonly conducted in terms that were rather neutral to the question whether the Bible carried revealed theological truths. In contemporary reconstitution in the Bible's authority, which the historian Jonathan Sheehan described illuminatingly in the European context, dictated that while American Old Testamentism would never be, quote, secular, end quote, they frequently mobilized the Bible in a de-theologized fashion de-theologized fashion that might be better understood through cultural than in religious terms. In many accounts, the Exodus functioned as a towering narrative and trope, fundamental in shaping the form and content of early American biblicism. The story of the enslaved Israelites who flee Egyptian tyranny, are elected by God as his chosen people during their long sojourn in the desert and take possession of the promised land, exerted tremendous influence over various segments of American society. Through the pre-Civil War years, Exodus remained a fundamental source for talking about politics and for exploring the meaning of nationhood. On the verge of Civil War, Americans such as the University of the City of New York law professor William B. Wedgwood still provided full-fledged accounts of the United States history at the repetition of the Exodus. Retelling the biblical story, Wedgwood pointed out that the Israelites, quote, were in bondage in Egypt for 430 years. Then God brought them out of Egypt, leading them by a pillar of cloud. He opened the gates of the sea of their passage. He gave them his covenant amid the thunders of Sinai. For 40 years he had led them through the wilderness. He then planted his chosen people in 13 Canaanite states. Prosperity and happiness followed them, and their names and the fame went out to the ends of the earth, end quote. Wedgwood, like numerous Americans before him, saw a direct link between the biblical Israel and the new American Israel. Now, end quote, in after days, end quote, Wedgwood asserted God, quote, selected another people, led them through the Red Sea of the Revolution, end quote, and finally, quote, planted them in 13 states, end quote. The creation of the two nations of Israel and the United States was sealed by the act of political compact, the federal constitution being, quote, another covenant delivered by the hand of another Moses, end quote. George Washington. Wedgwood was a typical rendition of the United States as a new Israel, which made use of typological like exegesis to tie biblical and modern events. Remarkably, such interpretation not only biblicized the United States by representing it in terms of a new Israel, but also Americanized biblical Israel, describing ancient Israel as a confederacy of tribes, as a quote-unquote union, in the manner of the United States, as Wedgwood has done, was common. So was dubbing the Israelite tribes as, quote, states, end quote, and miscounting them as 13, conforming to the sacred number of American patriotism instead of the conventional 12. Exodus then has been a key trope in the construction of the United States as a new Israel, and has consequently received much attention from scholars who study in shifting permutations through centuries of American history, from the Puritans to the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. Yet the Exodus' enduring influence in America, long after other biblical tropes were forgotten, may have obscured other equally important Old Testament structures and narratives. It is thus imperative to unveil the breadth of the American Old Testamentism, and in American Zion I explore Central Hebraic narratives and tropes, particularly those pertaining to Israel's quote, Republican, quote, phase, which were as relevant as the Exodus for coming to terms with the challenges and obstacles that the young United States confronted in the early decades. While I recognize the attraction contemporaries felt to the Republican periods of Israel's history, that phase in the annals of the Israelites and the Exodus was not the only one that captured their attention. For example, the notorious Hebrew kings Rehoboam and Ahab assumed an important role in ongoing deliberations in the United States on political authority and its limits. Rehoboam, whose tyranny and folly split Israel into two rival kingdoms, emerged in the public discourse with the recurrent anxieties about the viability of the American Union. From the Revolution, when George III was seen as America's Rehoboam, through the periodic threats of secession leading up to the Civil War, American political speakers revisited that king's disastrous reign, which ended with the dissolution of the Union of Israel's tribes. Characteristic was a powerful speech in which John C. Calhoun fiercely objected to the quote, tariff of abomination, end quote, by referring to the people of Israel's demanding from Rehoboam and the speaker's telling choice of words, quote, a repeal of the tariff, end quote. With the biblical example and the prospect of secession on the former vice president's mind, he asked whether it was possible, quote, even for a careless reader to pursue the history of that event without being forcibly struck with the analogy and the causes which led to their separation, and those which now threaten us with a similar calamity. End quote. The Southern Carolinian senator was only one of many antebellum Americans, Southerners and Northerners, quote, struck with the analogy, end quote, of Rehoboam's Israel and the United States. Ahab, the king who conspired to murder his subject Naboth in order to inherit his coveted vineyard, exemplified an even more malicious misappropriation of political power throughout the late 18th century and well into the 19th. Americans of many sorts and creeds repeatedly depicted their land as, quote, vineyards, end quote, craved by, quote, Ahabs, end quote. First imperial Englishmen, then whites, appropriating Indian lands, and Northerners attempting to force the South into their sphere of economic and political domination. As with Rehoboam, contemporaries saw, quote, striking parallels, end quote, to Ahab's conduct in various alleged usurpations. Perhaps the best known of these appears in the context of mid-century American expansionism, which David Lee Child helped identify as an act of coveting Naboth's vineyard in his celebrated tract, The Taking of Naboth's Vineyard, or History of the Texas Conspiracy, 1845. Herman Melville's Ahab, the tyrannical and monumental captain of the Pequod, testified to the power of that image in mid-19th century America. A few paragraphs cannot cover discourses as rich and long-standing as those involving Rehoboam or Ahab in pre-Civil War America. Note, however, how these kingly tropes, whose full chronological extent and full impact are yet to be recognized, function for decades in dramatically shifting historical context. The two figurative models emerge simultaneously and for decades were mainstays of American political discussion, providing the young nation with versatile political idioms, hence a much needed discursive stability. To come to terms with the Republic's predicaments, Rehoboam and Ahab further suggest the impressive lifespan of the American Old Testamentism, as both kings emerged as political tropes in the mid-1700s, 1770s, and all but disappeared after the Civil War, during which Southerners and their sympathizers likened Abraham Lincoln to both, never to regain their antebellum prominence. Their chronological trajectory from the Revolution to the Civil War is not only characteristic of the larger Old Testamentism manifested by these tropes. The use of Rehoboam and Ahab in the political discourse demonstrates the extent to which the Hebrew Bible's narratives were embedded in the political grammar of the young nation, providing observers with vocabularies through which to express their political attitudes and misgivings. The importance of these errant Israelite kings lies not in any of their particular materializations in a specific historical context, but in demonstrating at significant moments in the life of the Republic how the biblical language was available for communicating and articulating shared assumptions on the nature, uses, and abuses of political power. Most important, like Rehoboam and Ahab, may differ from the larger biblical discourse in significant ways. For example, both derive from Israel's monarchic and thus post-Republican era, they still participated in and reflected the intellectual construction of the United States as a second Israel. Rehoboam and Ahab were more than ciphers for political disunion and encroachment. Through these Israelite kings, generations of politically conscious Americans struggled to come to terms with the pitfalls that await their American Israel, that is, with their unease and fears of becoming unchosen or deselected. Election was not an unqualified blessing. Its contractual nature implied as both biblical Israelites and Americans came to realize a national life beset with high, almost unobtainable standards and ridden with a dread regarding Providence's continuing approval and affection. While being chosen may have been abetted concerns regarding the secular nature of the American Republican endeavor, it stirred a new array of anxieties related to the fragility of the favored situation that it promised. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Biblicism that I intend particularly to underscore in American Zion is its facilitation of attempts to transcend traditional figurative exegesis, expressing a striving for, quote, biblical authenticity, end quote, a radical typological sensibility that disposed contemporaries to present their nation as concretely or historically related to Old Testament history. They demonstrated such dispositions time and again, as they were not content with rendering America a metaphorical Israel. Understanding of national election and the notion of an American Israel were more than rhetorical and allegorical flourishes. They presented America's identity as a latter-day Israel in various ways, but most often as something deeply meaningful, tangible, and factual. This extreme biblicism, the attempt to construct concreteness into the bond with biblical Israel, was not concerted or planned, but was evident through a variety of otherwise unrelated phenomena that shared an underlying motivation to craft an American nation that is significant, in significant aspects was understood as Israelite. The construction of the sacred American geography by applying a biblical nomenclature to numerous towns and places is a well-known and comparatively mild manifestation of an intense and steadfast outlook. Originating in the colonial area, the Book of Mormon is another familiar manifestation of entwining Hebraic elements and America. In the following chapters, I elaborate other measures and efforts to similarly shape the United States as a biblical nation. These remarkable attempts reflect, as we shall come to see, the Janus-faced qualities of pre-Civil War American political culture that I shall stress, one that was simultaneously boastful and in constant need of reassurance, self-assured and perpetually anxious regarding its abilities and ultimate destiny. This polarity was evident already in the Revolutionary years. Ezra Stiles' renowned sermon, "The United States Elevated to Honor and Glory," 1783, has extraordinary buoyancy, shining through a sermon of tens of thousands of words. Stiles' optimism represents a recognizable facet of the identifications of the United States and biblical Israel. For him, being, quote, God's American Israel, end quote, meant the promise of future prosperity and national splendor. As Stiles, the president of Yale University, was confident as soon as the Revolutionary War was over that the states recently united, quote, may prosper and flourish into a great American republic and ascend to a high and distinguished honor among the nations of the earth, end quote. This sanguine outlook was based on a biblical history that demonstrated time and again that, quote, the secular welfare of God's ancient people, end quote, depended on their own conduct. Self-reliance promised Americans that as long as they continued to make the right choices, America's future, quote, prosperity and splendor, end quote, would be secure and paramount. Example of a correct choice was placing at the head of the Continental Army a leader such as George Washington, quote, the only man on whom the eyes of all America's Israel were placed, the American Joshua, end quote. American biblicism also entailed less upbeat sentiments. During the dark days of the Revolutionary War, Nicholas Street, pastor of East Haven Church, did not celebrate but lamented the American Israel's predicament. In Street's remarkable Jeremiah, Americans in their national capacity were, quote, acting over the part of the children of Israel in the wilderness, end quote. When times got hard, they, like the Israelites of old, began to, quote, murmur against Moses and Aaron, end quote. Street chastised chastised his compatriots. This is quote, "We are prone to act over the same stupid vile part that the children of Israel did in the wilderness," end quote. Such anxieties, which manifested the early modern quarrel with virtue-based politics, did not end with the American victory in the war. Triumph on the battlefield, to extend Street's elaborate metaphor, did not secure the United States. End quote. Quote, entrance into Canaan's rest, end quote. Hence the symbiotic relationship between biblical and recent history, between the ancient and modern chosen nations, did not entail only the uplifting narrative of Israel's nation and state building. Such concerns were still expressed 3 generations after the Revolution, when the aforementioned William Wedgwood, who witnessed the disintegration of the American Confederacy after the election of Abraham Lincoln as president, warned his compatriots, quote, "In the midst of Israel's prosperity, there was a dissolution of their union," end quote. In ominous moments in the life of the Republic, it seemed too obvious that America's union could falter, just like Israel's in the past. While Ezra Stiles and his numerous optimistic followers persistently reflected on a bright future of prosperity and splendor for the American Israel, others continued to identify their condition as a wilderness in a state of trouble and difficulty, the Egyptians pursuing us to overtake us and to reduce us. Chosenness meant that some Americans would always dread the Red Sea before us, end quote. As long as this was the case, Canaan's rest, like a mirage in a desert, would remain ever elusive. As I have shown elsewhere, contemporaries also appeal to historical models other than biblical Israel, particularly a republican Rome, which was a central element of late 18th century American historical and political imagination. Some of the differences between Israel and Rome are obvious. Rome's paganism contrasts sharply, for example, with the Hebrews' status as God's chosen. The two models also peaked in American culture at times. Rome's intellectual presence was most powerful during the constitutional era, and the aristocratic republic became less relevant as a political model with the swift democratization of American society after the turn of the 19th century. Biblical Israel, however, not only adapted to the dynamism of the early 19th century, but peaked during the Second Great Awakening, conventionally dated 1800 1840, especially between 1820 and 1830. By the era of the Civil War, it was not uncommon to hear that, quote, "the popular idea taught our youth," end quote, namely that, quote, "civil liberty was born and cradled in the ancient states of Greece and Rome," end quote, was false, but that the principle rather was, quote, "first taught by God himself to the ancient Hebrews," end quote. Differences aside, in chapters 1 and 2, I elaborate on deep connections and interrelations between the examples of republican Rome and biblical Israel into the American political imagination. The political scientist Donald Lutz was able to back up quantitatively Perry Miller's intuition regarding the prevalence of the Bible in the early United States. Lutz observed that during the founding era, which Lutz defines as 1760 through 1805, the source most frequently cited in political expositions was the Book of Deuteronomy. Perhaps even more surprising and significant is that even discounting the 75% of biblical references that appeared in reprint sermons, a huge cottage industry that accounted for 10% of all contemporary pamphlets, Lutz found that the quote non-sermon source of all contemporary pamphlets. I'm sorry, I read that already. The quote non-sermon source of biblical citations was roughly as important as the classical or common law categories, end quote. The prominence of the Bible would only increase during the second and third decades of the 19th century. Studying the rich political culture of the Revolution, the early Republic, and antebellum America, by scrutinizing political pamphlets, histories, public orations, private correspondence, sermons, poetry, newspaper essays, and other polemical and partisan writings, is how we latecomers may come to terms with the roles of the biblical history of the ancient Hebrews in the early United States. Such a broad reading provides a sense of the depth of American political culture, Old Testamentism, It also demonstrates how American authors, public speakers, and commentators developed sophisticated modes of probing through the Old Testament, the new nation's key problems, dynamics, and relationships, which enabled them and their contemporaries to better visualize their nascent national project. The fostering of a national consciousness was not, of course, an inevitable or foreordained result of the American Revolution. As a recent historian of the making of an American public reminds us, the Old Testament, specifically the history of biblical Israel, provided a productive intersection between politics and religion, a political theology which legitimized political novelties, but also helped unite a growing number of dynamic political entities. The American states around well-known and revered scriptural narratives, structures, and models. Throughout the pre-Civil War era, the Bible provided American revolutionaries with a critical perspective on Britain's management of the colonies and later on antebellum American politics, a medium for political discourse in the process of constitution making and then state building. A common fund of linguistic structures, legitimizing images and organizing assumptions, and as a usable political and sacred past. But as this book is focused more on the political imagination, the intellectual construction of social interaction, than on, quote, politics, end quote, as the negotiation and implementation of policy, its chapters are not organized as a linear narrative. Instead, American Zion consists of a series of investigations into overlooked and central aspects and themes of American political biblicism. The book takes, quote, Hebraic, end quote, moments and distinct vocabularies as vantage points from which to gain fresh insights into the process that were shaped by and in turn helped to drive the momentous transformations of the young American Republic. From the momentous transformations of the young American Republic from the Revolution to the era of the Civil War, this chronology is not an arbitrary prioritization, but points to the time frame in which the political biblicism first rose during the 1770s, peaked sometime around the year 1830 as the Second Great Awakening raged, and withered but did not vanish as the Civil War approached. By the end of the war, this American Old Testamentism had lost its vigor and morphed into a less committed abstract language. By the late 19th century, biblicism can no longer be considered a major component of national political discussion. The voices articulating the nation of the United States as a new Israel were overwhelmingly male, in step with much of the pre-Civil War political discourse. Nevertheless, there were extraordinary contributions by women who shared and further expressed their prevailing interest in the Old Testament. Such were, for example, Hannah More's doctrinaire biblical dramas, focused on Old Testament figures and intended to promote, quote, the love of piety and virtue in young persons, end quote. Decades later, Hannah Adams' expansive History of the Laws, 1812, provided another example of feminine participation in the contemporary and Hebraic discussion. Tellingly, female figures such as the prophetess Deborah and Jephthah's daughter were useful in the contemporary biblical republicanism. Nevertheless, these examples underscore the rule, namely that the theonational idea of America as the new Israel was a discourse articulated and dominated by the hegemonic group of white educated males. American Zionist chapters demonstrate that revolutionary Americans and subsequent generations read the Old Testament, particularly the history of the Israelite nation, as a civic humanist text to explore and propagate their republicanism. Chapter 1. That for decades, politicians and commentators, clergymen and laymen continued to appeal to the Mosaic Constitution as a template for organizing their community and justifying their distinct Republican federalism, and that they relied on the Old Testament's strict language, narrative forms in history, to formulate a biblical past for America and to sanctify their present. The book, in short, illustrates the powerful biblical consciousness that lifted the nation of the notion. The book, in short, illustrates a powerful biblical consciousness that lifted the notion of the second Israel to new heights. and spanned decades, peaking in the first third of the 19th century. Without grasping that biblicism, we cannot fully appreciate how and to what effect contemporaries conceived their sprawling Republican Federation. In American Zion, we see unveiled a lost world of biblical political imagination or the negotiation of nationhood, which deepens our understanding, of course, of the most profound aspects and enduring issues of the American experience. Hence, this potent biblicism helped invigorate, for example, the construction of such ideologies as manifest destiny and the self-righteous that justified and thus facilitated the carnage of the Civil War. Comprehending such crucial yet pivotal, unnoticed dimensions of distinct Old Testament biblicism that emerged during the Revolution and played out in the first half of the 19th century transforms our understanding of early American political culture. In fact, we cannot properly understand the political culture of early America unless we appreciate how and to what effect contemporaries drew on their sense of ancient Israel's political history and the ways in which that history helped construct their views on their nation. The identification of the United States as the Israel of its time made contemporaries aware of the possibility that their nation might eventually fall from grace. Yet before the Civil War, the Union, periodically seemingly deficient and fragile, and in hindsight, rightly so, that identification enabled contemporaries to cope with the hardships that plagued the commonwealths of the past, which Republicans traditionally attributed to Fortuna, the immoral goddess of secular chance. When the children of Israel did wrong in the sight of the Lord, they may have been punished, but even then they were not left alone to face fortune's whims. The history of the biblical Israel enabled contemporaries to express and shape understandings of history and politics, even as their experiences reshaped their attitudes to the Bible. Since the Hebrew Bible began receding in the political discourse after the first third of the 19th century, to an extent and for some reasons that were not sufficiently clear until now, we have yet to fully appreciate the degree to which American national culture was carved out in a deeply Hebraic setting. While the Bible may not have provided contemporaries with new ideas about the conduct of the modern polities, it did not constitute a new political philosophy. The Old Testament biblicism operated in a cosmology that was arguably more important than straightforward declarative propositions. The biblicism furnished a powerful justification, a rationale and motivation for ideas and modes of action which otherwise may have been unacceptable or even inconceivable. This book reveals a political culture of an American people who, like the patriarch Moses, forged a nation and were within the reach of the promised land of modernity. Like Moses, they grappled with questions of human legitimacy and authority and agency and fought to set the better angels of their natures free. Like Moses, they had to wait for the future generations to make the final step and fulfill their nation's promise.